Supporting celibacy, Pope Benedict XVI writes a new book on the crisis in the church and priestly ministry, why it prompted an immediate response from the Vatican. Violence in Tehran. Police and protesters clash in Iran after the government acknowledges its role in the downing of a Ukrainian jetliner. Cardinal Pell update. The most senior Catholic clergy member found guilty of abuse has been transferred to a different prison. We'll explain. And welcome to the church. Dozens of babies and their parents take over the Sistine Chapel. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, January 13th, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sabol. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI reaffirms the necessity of pre-celibacy in a new book he wrote. The book is called From the Depths of Our Hearts, Priesthood, Celibacy, and the Crisis of the Catholic Church. Cardinal Robert Sarah, head of the Vatican's Liturgy Office, co-authored the book with Benedict, from which excerpts were published in a French newspaper last night. This comes at a time when Pope Francis is expected to decide whether to allow married men to become priests in regions such as the Amazon, where there is a shortage of Catholic priests. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us now. Thank you for joining us, Ed.
Good to be with you, Tracy.
And so why did Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI and Cardinal Sarah write this book on the priesthood and clerical celibacy?
Well, it's really meant, Tracy, to respond to what they call the crisis in the priesthood. They say there's been a lot of scandal, a lot of discouragement of priests in the last few years, and they feel that this book really is there to encourage them and to continue with their priesthood and to help them. And it's really what they call a homage to priests. And it's also to warn against any changes to the clerical celibacy rule in the Latin Church, which could happen because of the upcoming apostolic exhortation which Pope Francis is to produce in the coming few weeks, which could say, following the synod on the Amazon last year, which could actually change the clerical celibacy rule in the Latin Rite in some remote places in the Amazon, which could then become a universal change. So they're concerned about that, and that's why they've written this book.
Yeah, and how did the book come about?
Well, it came about through exchanges between Benedict and Cardinal Sarah, going back actually to January last year. They thought of having some sort of collaborative effort, but they weren't sure how that would what sort of form that would take. And then when the synod happened last year on the Amazon, and this decision was made by the synod fathers to go forward with a proposal to change the celibacy rule, then they felt they needed to write something to make to really underline the importance of apostolic tradition, to the ecclesiastical discipline of clerical celibacy, and that's why they wrote this book, again, really just to uphold that teaching and to basically say that they don't want it changed.
Well, the Vatican issued a statement this afternoon clarifying Pope Francis's position on clerical celibacy. What exactly is his position, and how may this book affect his document on the synod in a few weeks' time?
Yes, well, his position has been really very much in continuity with the previous popes, in the sense that he said that he doesn't want to change it. But on the other hand, he has also said that in remote areas of the Amazon, or what he says are Pacific Islands, as he gave an example in an interview last year, he said, well, maybe there can be changes in order to bring the sacraments to places where there are shortages of priests. And so he says he's kind of open to it. He certainly wants study done into it, and that's why he allowed this to be discussed at the synod last year. Now, this, as I said earlier, this could then take the form of the Pope approving this proposal, which passed in the synod, to change the clerical celibacy rule in his apostolic exhortation, which is due in a few weeks' time. So what this book does really is puts pressure on Pope Francis really not to make that change. So it'll be very interesting to see what decision he finally makes on this.
All right. Thank you so much. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tracy.
Father Joseph Fessio, Ignatius Press founder and editor, joins me now by Skype from San Francisco to talk more about From the Depths of Our Hearts, Priesthood, Celibacy, and the Crisis of the Catholic Church. Father, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, Tracy. Always glad to be here.
Both the Pope Emeritus and Cardinal Sarah describe themselves as two bishops in filial obedience to Pope Francis, who are seeking the truth in a spirit of love for the unity of the Church as they speak out in favor of the discipline of celibacy. How important do you think that statement is?
Well, it's very important because they are speaking the truth. And this is not a book which is written in opposition to Pope Francis, but rather in support of Pope Francis. In fact, they quote him very, very positively in the book. So they're just trying to help support him with more knowledge about what the pastoral and ecclesiastical consequences are of a potential ordination as a general rule of viri probati, or mature men, married men.
What do the Pope Emeritus and Cardinal Sarah have to say about the relationship between priestly ministry and celibacy?
Since Cardinal Sarah is from Guinea, which is a French-speaking part of Africa, I always refer to him as Sarah. He may say Sarah in English, but in French it would be Sarah because you always accent the last syllable. And I like to say Cardinal Sarah rhymes with hurrah. He's a wonderful man of the Church. He's a very close friend of Benedict's. And Benedict himself was thinking of writing something about the priesthood and priestly celibacy, but he said in the book, he says, lassitude, I was getting weary and old, I put it aside. But then when Cardinal Sarah came, we began discussing these things. That motivated me to finish this. And so Pope Benedict has a masterful little, maybe 45 pages on the priesthood, where he really goes to the root of the problem, Tracy. He says that it goes all the way back to Vatican Council II, not the council itself, what happened after the council. There was a misunderstanding of exegesis. That's kind of complicated, right? But interpreting scripture, namely unwillingness of modern scripture scholars to see the Old Testament as having a spiritual meaning which is fulfilled in the New. So, for example, Pope Benedict takes the Psalm 15, verses 5 and 6, where it said, my lot is a chosen one. The Lord is my portion and my cup. He's my inheritance. That referred to the Levitical priests, that they gave up everything for God. They had no land like the other tribes did. And this was a foreshadowing, a prefiguring of the priesthood in the time of Christ and the New Testament, so that a priest has to be someone who gives up everything to serve the Lord. That's just one example where Ratzinger does an exegesis, an interpretation of an Old Testament passage, and shows how it applies to the New Testament priesthood.
Father, Pope Francis has in the past indicated his support of clerical celibacy. What's your response to critics who say that this book is written from an anti-Pope Francis perspective and that it's an attempt to influence him ahead of his apostolic exhortation on the Amazonian Synod?
Well, it's an attempt to help him and strengthen him in his own intentions, because he said on the plane on the way back from Rio de Janeiro last year, 2019, I would rather die than eliminate the celibate priesthood. I would rather die than do that. Pope Francis says that. So this is not against Pope Francis. This is for Pope Francis. But Pope Francis has a lot of pressure on him. I think it's good for the Pope to realize that men of this stature, Pope Benedict, who is one of the greatest theologians of our time, perhaps of all time, and Cardinal Sarah, who is a brilliant and very pastoral bishop, have them speak out so clearly about this.
What are the book's main points regarding the crisis of priestly ministry in the Catholic Church?
Well, basically, they're saying that since the council, because this misunderstanding of the Old Testament, there's been this idea that the priesthood is kind of a function, and that celibacy is an imposition of the Church only gradually, brought into the picture. But that's not true. In fact, Cardinal Sarah very clearly in his section quotes, by the way, 3 other books by Ignatius Press, one by Father Coccini called The Apostolic Origins of Priestly Celibacy, which shows that from the very beginning, married priests were continent. That is, it was always the understanding that if you're going to be a priest, even if you're married, that you had to live as brother and sister with your wife. That's an unbroken tradition, in the Catholic Church until about the 1900s, late 1900s. So that's one thing. Secondly, Cardinal Sarah quotes Cardinal Stickler, Alphonse Stickler, a book that we also published called The Case for Clerical Celibacy, where Stickler shows, for example, the same thing, that priestly continence, and celibacy goes back to the apostles and the sub-apostolic times, the earliest church. And that the Eastern Orthodox practice is a mistake that happened by a fraudulent reading of a text in 692 at the Council of Trellis. So that's another book. And then also Father Hyde's book on priestly celibacy. So Cardinal Sarah has done his homework. He's a scholar as well as a man of the church. And so he's made it clear that from the very beginning, there was always this understanding that a priest had to be united with Christ, the high priest. Christ is the spouse of the church, which is his bride. And therefore, the priestly life means giving oneself totally and entirely to the church. And it's a derogation or a devaluation of marriage to think that a person can have a total commitment to his wife and children and a total commitment to his bride, the church. It's a kind of bigamy.
Some critics have asserted that Benedict XVI's retirement represents a commitment to absolute silence and that this represents a violation of that silence that he promised.
Well, I mean, there's no rule or regulation or commandment that applies to a pope who has resigned. I mean, it's only happened once in the last few hundred years. And he did want to be silent and pray for the church. But at the very beginning, he and Cardinal Sarah quote St. Augustine saying, "Non posso silere," I can't be silent because I can't rest in my ecclesiastical dignity. The church has need of a strong voice now, and I'm going to speak. And so if it weren't very serious, of course, he wouldn't have broken the silence. That must make this book so important. And by the way, it's not just important for now, and it's not just important for priests. This book has to do with the very structure of the Catholic Church, the heart of the Catholic Church, and the heart of the priesthood. And their pastoral hearts would not let them be silent. That's why they call this book From the Depths of Our Hearts.
Well, Father, thank you so much for your insight. We really appreciate it.
Tracy, good talking to you. God bless you. Keep up the good work.
Cardinal George Pell has been transferred to a different prison in Australia. Local media reports the move came after a drone illegally flew overhead in a suspected attempt to photograph the famous inmate while he was working in a garden. Officials are not commenting on the whereabouts of the 78-year-old. The most senior Catholic clergy member found guilty of sexual abuse is set to have his appeal heard in March. President Donald Trump warns Iran not to hurt protesters. They're upset that the Iranian government tried to conceal its role in shooting down a passenger plane. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Mark?
Tracy, President Trump faces more questions about his decision to kill Iran's top military general and whether that decision was justified. But the president is turning his support toward Iranian protesters and trying to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons.
President Trump writes to the leaders of Iran, "Do not kill your protesters. Thousands have already been killed or imprisoned by you, and the world is watching. More importantly, the USA is watching." Anger swelled today in Iran over the accidental shoot-down of a Ukrainian jetliner. Video appears to show security forces firing live ammunition and tear gas to disperse protesters. President Trump says he supports the protesters, but he faces criticism from Democrats for ordering the drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. And lawmakers say they were not satisfied by last week's intelligence briefings.
I was very disappointed in the briefing on Wednesday to all the senators, but even the briefing on Tuesday left a whole lot of unanswered questions.
Many Republicans still support the president's move, even though it increased tension with Iran.
The question to ask ourselves is, did he have the authority, the legal authority, to kill a combatant on the battlefield? And I think that the authorization of military force passed in 2002, gave the President of the United States the authority to do that.
President Trump also defends his decision, tweeting, "The fake news media and their Democrat partners are working hard to determine whether or not the future attack by terrorist Soleimani was imminent or not. And was my team in agreement? The answer to both is a strong yes, but it doesn't really matter because of his horrible past."
Global leaders have called for de-escalation and dialogue between Iran and the U.S. Both countries have declared they do not want war, but tension has increased since President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal. Tracy.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. In Australia, crews battling the deadly wildfires say they are on the offensive for the first time in weeks. A break in weather is helping to calm the blazes. They are responsible for at least 27 deaths and have scorched an area larger than the U.S. state of Indiana. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says Northern Ireland has a very bright future. He was speaking after a deal was struck to resume the Parliament in Belfast for the first time in 3 years. The country had been without a functioning administration since January 2017 over arguments following a botched green energy project. Staying in the UK, the Queen has agreed to let Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle move to Canada part-time. The Queen's agreement came after a summit of the royal family today. Prince Harry and his wife Meghan will remain part of the House of Windsor. They recently expressed an interest in having a more independent life and to spend more time in North America. Prince Harry is sixth in line to the British throne. Coming up, analysis of the impeachment case against President Donald Trump as it prepares to move to the Senate. President Trump says the Senate should simply dismiss the impeachment case against him. The suggestion comes as the House prepares to send over the long-awaited articles of impeachment. Catholic News Agency's Matt Hadra reports now from Capitol Hill. Matt?
Good evening, Tracy. Some Democrats have complained about Speaker Pelosi delaying the transfer of the articles of impeachment, but Pelosi herself and other Democratic Party leaders defend the strategy. They say it produced potential evidence and helped turn public attention to the upcoming trial.
President Trump says the Senate should skip the impeachment trial completely, tweeting, "Many believe that by the Senate giving credence to a trial, it gives the partisan Democrat witch hunt credibility that it otherwise does not have." And as Democrats press for trial witnesses to be called, it's Adam Schiff, the Democratic chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and Speaker Pelosi, who President Trump wants to hear testify. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says the president's attempt to block witnesses shows he is scared.
I think he's hiding something, and that's why he's so afraid of witnesses and documents.
And Senator Schumer wants to see former National Security Advisor John Bolton forced to testify.
John Bolton is a key witness, and so he should be subpoenaed. And if he is subpoenaed, executive privilege won't stop him.
On a Sunday talk show, Pelosi warned the senators who are thinking now about voting for witnesses or not, they will have to be accountable for not having a fair trial. But Republicans shoot back. The time for witnesses is over.
I think the Speaker needs to acquaint herself with the Constitution, and it is not the job of the Senate to try to fix the completely faulty and flawed process that the House Democrats conducted over here, impeaching the president based on assumptions with no direct evidence, and then begging and pleading with the Senate to do the House's job for them.
Some Republicans appear open to witness testimony, a decision Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate will make at the proper time.
The timing of the trial could benefit some Democrats on the campaign trail, like former Vice President Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, who are not senators and do not have to be in Washington for the trial. Tomorrow, all eyes will be on Speaker Pelosi as she meets with her House Democratic caucus. Tracy?
Catholic News Agency's Matt Hadra reporting for us from Capitol Hill. Thanks a lot, Matt. And joining me now to talk about how it could all play out is Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller and co-host of Mornings on the Mall on WMAL Radio. Vince, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Well, Vince, last week, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced that he has the 51 votes required to launch the trial based on the model of President Clinton's impeachment trial in 1999. So what does that look like?
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, was holding on to the articles of impeachment for an entire month. And she did that because she wanted the leverage to basically say, do this trial the way I want you to do it. And Senator McConnell came along and said, no, I don't even want the articles, but if you're going to send them, we'll do them the way it was done in 1999, which means they'll vote on the procedures first, and then witnesses, that'll be handled later. And they'll take that on a case-by-case basis, whether or not they'll call any witnesses.
Yeah, Vince, what does that indicate for witness testimony?
Well, we'll see whether or not there even is any witness testimony. One of the interesting things that did happen in the interim period after Nancy Pelosi held the articles of impeachment is then John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, indicated, yeah, hey, I'd be willing to testify in the Senate. The effect of that, though, is not going to be much because the president's already said in an interview last week that he would say invoke executive privilege and make it so John Bolton's testimony would be rendered pointless. He wouldn't be able to say anything before in a Senate trial. And at this point, it doesn't look like we should expect any dramatic witness testimony.
Chief Justice John Roberts is expecting to fill the role of the presiding officer. How significant is that he's directing these proceedings?
Well, it's constitutionally prescribed. He's got to do this. He's going to run the proceedings in the Senate. But remember, ultimately, it really does fall to whoever controls the votes in the Senate. And in this case, unless a couple of Republicans break off, it's Mitch McConnell who's really running the show over there.
All right. And senators will take an oath by which they affirm to, quote, do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws. So help me God. And so much as political conversation around impeachment on both sides of the aisle has really been partisan.
Yes.
You know, and we're looking to hear when the trial begins. Do you think we're going to see a shift?
No. It's going to be partisan. That's the whole point of this. And in fact, I think Republicans, as you played in the sound a few minutes ago, are rightly pointing out, like, look, the Democrats who are dissatisfied with what they gathered in the House, if your kid went up to the teacher and turned in a half-complete assignment, you don't tell the teacher, finish it for me. So I think Republicans are going to have a nice opportunity here to say, anything that you didn't include from the House, sorry, that's your failure.
Yeah. Vince, any final thoughts?
Just that this is a big moment in American history, yes, given that there is an impeachment before us. But the other side of this is, I think a lot of Americans look at this and say, okay, over what? And it seems like it's politics, because we went from a hysterical moment to hysterical moment to hysterical moment, that this one doesn't even feel unique in the entire time of the Trump presidency.
Yeah, Vince, thanks so much for joining us. We really
much.
appreciate it. Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller. Thanks again.
Sure.
New Jersey Senator Cory Booker is ending his bid for president. The Democrat announced his plans to drop out of the presidential race today. Booker launched his campaign last February, but failed to raise the money needed in order to support a White House bid. Booker's exit now narrows the field to 12 Democratic candidates. The House passed a bill Friday aimed at cleaning up chemicals in drinking water. Republican Kathy McMorris Rodgers pushed for an amendment to modify the bill to specifically protect unborn babies.
Today, Speaker Pelosi reiterated the importance of protecting expectant mothers. By rejecting this amendment, you would be further denying the science of the development of a child in the womb. This motion to recommit is simple, it's clear, it's direct. It clarifies the protection of vulnerable populations must include any unborn child.
The bill sets a deadline for the EPA to limit industrial chemicals known as PFAS. House Democrats voted against the pro-life amendment 219-4. The bill now faces a tough fight in the GOP-controlled Senate. Up next, Pope Francis says the best Christians are meek and humble, and why the Sistine Chapel looked a lot younger yesterday.
Se Gesù è tutto dalla parte di Dio, è anche tutto dalla parte dell'uomo.
Pope Francis tells Christians of today to adopt the meek and simple attitude of Jesus. At his Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father says Christ fulfills his mission with a style that goes against the spirit of the world, and we can do the same. All we have to do is remember God's limitless love for us. Pope Francis baptized 32 babies, including 2 sets of twins yesterday in the Vatican Sistine Chapel. On the Feast of Christ being baptized in the Jordan River, the Holy Father reiterated the importance of baptism. He says that it is vital that children are given the power of the Holy Spirit. He also put the families at ease by saying crying children were free to remain in the chapel, and if needed, mothers were welcome to nurse their children. Bishops from North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota are in Rome this week, and today they met with Pope Francis. The group also celebrated Mass at the Vatican. Bishop John Quinn of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester, in Minnesota gave the homily. He said, despite the great challenges of today, Scripture shows us Jesus was a real person, and we should never be afraid to approach him for help. The meetings are part of the traditional visits between U.S. bishops and the Holy Father. And finally tonight, today is the feast of St. Hilary of Poitiers. The 4th century bishop and doctor of the church defended the church and its members against the Arian heresy that called into question the divinity of Jesus. He was considered one of the most learned theologians of his age. St. Hilary died in the year 367. He passed on his teachings and a way of life to a number of students, including St. Martin of Tours. We thank you for watching tonight, and for the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sabol. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.